It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Pavlina Tcherneva, President of the Levy Economics Institute, one of the world's leading experts on job guarantees and labour market policies more generally, and author of The Case for a Job Guarantee. I first saw Pavlina give a talk at Bard College back in 2012, and ever since then, I've seen her as a leader in what is, for me, the most valuable school of thought in economics, and one of the two main themes that runs through our master's degree, and of course, I mean an MT. Pavlina's work has influenced the way a lot of us think about job quality, precarity, and economic security, and why all of this matters politically as well as economically. Today, she'll be speaking on the enshittification of jobs and the shifting political allegiance of the US working class, a look at how deteriorating job opportunities have reshaped both people's lives and the political landscape, and the lessons we can draw from that. So we're really delighted to have her with us. And with that, it's over to Pavlina.
Thank you so very, very much. As I was saying earlier, I've been looking forward to joining the seminar for a while. I'm glad we were able to work it out. And also, it gives me opportunity to talk about some things that are related to the job guarantee that have occupied my mind in the last 12 months. And talk about a couple of papers that I've been working on, and also a book project that Randy Ray and I are also undertaking as we speak. And I think this work broadly fits into the research area that shows that economic precarity does correlate strongly with a shift of the electorate to the right. And there are just so many ways in which we could tackle this. But one of the biggest paradoxes that, maybe not a big paradox, but one of the very first things that I noticed the day after Election Day in November 2024 was that even as the country voted for Trump, red states voted for progressive policies. And, I first spotted, some minimum wage ordinances, some ballot measures on paid leave in red states. And I started going through these in this election cycle, but also going through ballot initiatives, since the late 90s. And I'll talk more about that in my talk, but it was really striking. In some ways, ballot measures, they are citizen initiated. They are representative one of the most direct ways in which we can think of direct democracy, in ways in which people can communicate their wishes. So, I was very interested in what's going on there. In the meantime, I've been following the work of Cory Doctorow. I'm pretty sure many of you know him. He is a journalist. He is a tech expert, an author, science fiction author. And of course, he came up with this term called enshittification, which took the world by storm and even made it first in it's the Australian dictionary. I'm forgetting the name. It escapes me. It's issued in Australia, but then it also made it into the Webster dictionary. So it became an official word, acknowledged for a word to really refer to something that has been happening to digital platforms, kind of the erosion of the quality and the service. But people have been using this term as a shorthand for everything is going to hell, right? Everything is becoming, is deteriorating. If there was a service that was once considered high quality, now the experience has been eroded. So it's been used as a shorthand, but as I was reading some of his analysis, and he is applying it to tech sector, and he is applying it to digital platforms like Twitter and mass communication media platforms, he identified a process which to me described almost perfectly the erosion of the working experience of working people. And that I think that kind of analysis could really broadly be applied to the concept of precarity, but there was a bit more of a theoretical content behind it. And so as I'll show in my talk, I just wanted to augment this analysis with the work of Hyman Minsky and specifically his theory of the capitalist development, a theory of development of capitalism. So there's a fair amount that I would like to cover here in this talk, and it all connects to themes that the modern money approach has emphasized. Of course, the job guarantee. And so it's another way for me to articulate how the job guarantee is a policy intervention that can really reverse engineer the labor market. So that's one aspect of this work. And the other one, I want to then zero in a little bit on what's happening in the US, how the electorate has been shifting allegiances over the last years, but really over the last few decades. And, I want to argue that that really has to do with the enshittification of jobs, with the rise of precarity, and so on. And, okay, and so there are a few other kind of MMT themes that kind of run through this, but broadly we're going to be talking about more politics, I think, a little less economics. Okay, all right. So, I wrote this paper, people can look it up on the Levy Institute website, called The Death of the Social Contract and Enshittification of Jobs. And my main thesis is that there has been a degradation in the labor market, of observable degradation, and that can be analyzed through the evolution of the capitalist system. But specifically, it's linked to certain kind of promises that were made in the post-war social contract of what should constitute economic security. And there was a missing piece in that social contract, and that missing piece was the assurance of a good job. And that had led to the abandonment of the social contract, but also to a whole host of other developments in the labor market that had led to modern day inequality, precarity, uncertainty in work. And then I want to connect this to all of these postmortems that we, at least in the United States, we were observing, especially after 2024. There were a bunch of commentators that zeroed in on the economic drivers of the voting behavior, and specifically there was a lot of hand wringing in the Democratic Party. Why the electorate supported did not show up for them the way they did for Biden. And the argument that I'm making here is a strong, I think, position that the Democratic Party in the United States traditionally was associated with a very broad coalition of voters across the nation that came together, really was stitched together by the promises of the New Deal and the welfare reforms that were initiated, from Social Security to working hour regulations to anti-monopoly regulation, etc. That it was far-reaching. That it brought together under the New Dealers umbrella many people to the Democratic Party. Over the years, however, there has been a very steady retreat from the Democratic Party of working class voters. A lot of folks thought this was a problem of this past election. It definitely was not. This was a long-term process, a long-term loss of the traditional base of the Democratic Party. And indeed, you can very much make the case that the party has now become the party of the comfortable classes. The well-to-do, those who enjoy relative economic security. And Randy and I make this argument in another policy note, policy brief at the Levy Institute, that in fact the swing voter is the working class voter. In every election, some pundit will look for some group of people, some category of people that went one way or the other. But at the end of the day, really, it's the working class voter that determines most of these outcomes. And of course, pocketbook issues are the ones that are very important, and very often, and even sometimes to the surprise of some commentators, they will eclipse cultural issues. Okay. So, okay, so we're going to go through some ballot initiatives, some polling. We're going to look at, like the state of working America briefly. And then, really the thesis, and this is part of the book that we are writing now with Randy, is that it is very important what kind of vision is being articulated for, well, in this case, for America. The vision for the economy, really. More importantly. And so we survey economic visions that have been put forward in the post-war era. And we find that, there are visions that are positive and there are visions that are negative. But when they're clearly articulated, they do the job. Presidential candidates who do not have strongly articulated vision do not do so well, and I think that can explain some of the more recent electoral patterns. But the vision that we believe is more consistent with the wishes of the American electorate is actually a far more progressive vision than most people realize. And the American public is far more progressive than is typically understood. So let's just go through some of these. The enshittification, very briefly, this metaphor that I said, Cory Doctorow put together, he basically describes this particular cycle, the digital platforms experience, that is described by a bait, trap, and switch. You first attract the users with some pretty good service. Like you remember, Facebook is free, Twitter was free, now you kind of have to pay for, etc. Right? You lure the user with something that is relatively useful. People find a forum where they can communicate, they can come together, they can find ways in which they can share ideas that were previously not possible, and that is a really good service. But then you have the network effects, right? These systems become quite large. It's very difficult to opt out of Twitter and or X and your community that you've built there and switch to Blue Sky and that sort of thing. And that these networks kind of create a captive audience. And then they start attracting businesses. So then you start seeing all of the advertising and all of the sorts of things that really ruin the experience of these networks. And then these networks start exploiting all groups, both the businesses and the advertisers and the consumers, etc. So I'm not going to go into it, but if you're interested in technology, I think it is very well explained in Cory's work. And I think that this logic of bait, trap, switch is something that can be applied to other parts of social life when you can't escape, a particular network. And especially this logic will pervade essential services, right? Everybody needs healthcare. There is an opt-out, right? There's no way of finding an alternative to housing or utilities. And if those tend to be provided by mega providers and monopolists with monopoly power, then you really become the captive audience there, and you're at the whims of the pricing power and other power of big businesses. And this is true for the labor market as well. Okay, so I think that in the labor market, maybe we can call it a lock, bait, and switch process. And the reason is because in a modern market economy, the lock is the inescapable necessity of a paid job for survival. This is a monetary production economy. We are not, collectively, we don't have access to, land, machinery, the so-called means of production. We have to work. And it is a monetized economy, so, paid work is a critical component of this economic system. And very few of us can survive without access to paid work. So that is kind of the primary engine of social provisioning. Acknowledging, of course, that there is a vast amount of unpaid work, a vast amount of volunteer work, and that too is very much dependent on those who participate in paid work, right? So there are important kind of dynamics and interlinkages there. The bait, however, is what I explained, was the post-war social contract. we all know history. We all know how during the progressive era in the 1800s, how labor worked, for many, many decades to win over some of the basic protections that we now enjoy, right? Whether it is fire exits, whether it is basic safety, whether it is banning child labor, this didn't happen overnight with the New Deal. This was decades in the making of workers fighting for their rights. And finally, the New Deal and the new social order post World War II, the new social reformers conceived of a wide-ranging framework for economic security that was previously not part of the policy package of any country. And this was transformative. I mean, it was truly revolutionary because we now legitimated these fights, these worker decades-long struggles, and they became part of the law. Of course, the struggle continued to make sure that the law applies, and nevertheless, they were legal now ways in which labor could negotiate with their employers. They can ask for their wages or stolen wages, etc., etc. Now, the social contract, as I've often pointed out in my other work, was, or at least in the United States, the New Deal framework was based kind of on a two-pronged strategy to provide income security and job security. And the income security tended to take the form of Social Security for the retired, unemployment insurance for the unemployed, and some other income support programs. But really, the primary goal, the primary kind of raison d'etre of the social contract is that we will create a system where there will be good jobs, and they will be jobs that people can live on and support their families, right? Except this, the assurance of a good job was predicated in the West, on an economy that was juiced up in a way by all the spending from World War II, right? Massive government expenditure that did create full employment for a time. But this was by no means a guarantee, right? It was more or less the environment in which, in which these countries operated, but it was not a guarantee. And kind of the two-legged stool was missing one of its legs, the assurance of employment security. Unemployment insurance was very much a poor substitute for the guarantee of a good job. And so, I go through the paper through this process by which I explain how unemployment then creates all of these various perverse problems in the labor market, create unemployability, create an environment where unemployment forever becomes the most important tool that firms have over their working people. And once you have unemployment as a structural force of negotiation and economy, you can't fight adequately for your minimum wages, even if they're legally mandated. You can't fight adequately for your benefits. You can't fight adequately for your time off to take care of a sick parent. I mean, the threat of unemployment, even if implicit, even in a fully employed economy, is still there, and it's critical. So the switch happens when full employment gets abandoned, and the 70s and the 80s no longer produce an economy that has tight labor markets. And so economists, policymakers, the like, just abandon even the pretense that we're going to have a fully employed economy, and that would be a policy goal. We redefine full employment as some measure of unemployment. We weaponize the naira. I've talked a lot about all of these things, and so I'm going to skip them, but I think you're all familiar. And so here we can add another very important force, and this is the force of financialization. Because as precarity increases, then we see the increasing indebtedness of households, because debt starts to bridge the gap between stagnant wages and rising costs. And when you bring into the analysis Minsky's own work, then you start understanding how the financial sector in fact lives on the existence of debt and indebtedness, and the household sector becomes its largest customer in some sense, or captive customer, maybe not the largest, because big corporations, big finance are the largest customers, but because the most reliable captive customer, right? So we have all of these perverse dynamics, and they are kind of engineered. They are not inevitable. In a sense, the four forces that once prevented this decline, in the immediate post-war era, we had the golden age of the American economy, and that fully employed economy, so-called fully employed economy, was held together by these four guardrails. You've got competition, so when you have tight labor markets, full employment, firms compete for workers. And that, the workplace meant that when you go to work, the company is going to train you, is going to provide you the equipment, they're going to try to retain you when you have many choices. In terms of regulation, government did set labor standards. And then there's something, Corey calls it interoperability, and it has a particular meaning in technology, is when you can't really have open source, and you can't use, you can't jump from one provider to another. Let's say you contract with Audible to produce your audiobook. You can't really, they have exclusive rights on production. You can't even own your intellectual labor. You can't really even, go elsewhere. And there are technical reasons why this interoperability is essential, because it locks you into these platforms. Well, it's a very similar thing in the labor market. Your ability, for many workers, the ability to take your skill and move to a better employer is by law constrained. There are so many non-disclose clause, non-compete clause. How many corporate jobs are there that tell you cannot work for a competitor, right? You need to have, you have some kind of, a buffer between, the time you leave a company and where you go. How many jobs say, well, you have to bring your own equipment, buy your own equipment to build the skill to work for us. But if for some reason that doesn't work out and you need to be laid off, then you bear the cost of that investment, not the firm. So there are all sorts of ways in which your capacity to work or move to other places is being constrained. And basically worker power is being constrained on many different levels. But when you have strong unions, strong collective bargaining, competition and regulation, then you have worker power. And this is basically more or less what is missing in the contemporary context. It's not as simple, there are big businesses, right? It's not simple, there are monopolies, but it is, it's all of these layers in which monopolies basically impact worker power. So these forces have been systematically eroded under money manager capitalism. And did I get to Minsky? No, I didn't. Maybe I'll go, maybe I have it in another slide that is missing. Oh, somewhere here. Okay. So, Minsky talks about how there are different varieties of capitalism, and some varieties, capitalism, fundamentally is a flawed system, but some varieties of capitalism are a little more secure, a little more stable than others. And I think, when you study why managerial welfare capitalism, this kind of post-war golden age capitalism that is based on the social contract, was relatively more stable, you can study that through these different constraining forces that I discussed. But then, of course, we have the shift to a money manager capitalism where finance becomes so important, where we have rapid dismantling of regulations, worker protection, shift from production and employment to financialization, stock gains, asset stripping, and a consolidation of corporate power, which becomes ever bigger, and finance becomes a dominant driver of the form of capitalism in which we're living in. So, this financialized stage basically creates certain kinds of incentives, certain kind of conditions that actually reproduce the enshittification across all sectors, across healthcare, across labor markets, across housing, right? The financialization of these essentials is kind of one of the major forces of enshittification. All right, so we did that, and I'm going to kind of skip this. Basically we already said household debt is a life support system. Work no longer provides economic security. And so when you have weaker competition, you have less worker leverage, worse conditions, further erosion of power. Now, very quickly, I'm not going to talk about the job guarantee. I think many of you are familiar, but basically, as I said at the beginning, what I argue here is that the job guarantee is kind of like a circuit breaker of these processes. When you have a public option for jobs, which is permanent, open-ended, federally funded, with a floor, stable floor for wages and benefits, you can have so many different effects on the labor market and on the economy as a whole that it does kind of disrupt these vicious cycles that we are observing. And one of the key things for the job guarantee is that it really is the labor standard. I know that many of us like to emphasize different things for the job guarantee, the stabilizing features, and I've gone through that list myself in my own work. But precarity so defines the human experience and how people see themselves, and of course it has political consequences, that I think it is absolutely essential that we have a decency floor. And we haven't had a broader rethinking of what this should constitute. Like, what should constitute a good job? How should it be provided? At the policy level, we don't have that kind of conversation that is perhaps the counterpart of what the post-war, New Deal's, conversations were. And then the other thing about the job guarantee is that this is like a de facto regulator, right? It is just by virtue of its existence, it establishes so many different, the baseline living wage, etc., and that it is a one policy with multi-dimensional impacts on labor, on wages, on benefits, on working conditions, etc. So this interoperability that I was talking about, we're providing job training that builds skills in high social need sectors, right? We provide the opportunity to transition out of the program. Essentially, it is the competition that is missing in the labor market, right? And so that helps build worker power, because there is no genuine opt-out today, right? There's very few people can genuinely just leave their job and go elsewhere. Okay. All right, so we can switch this and just say that we need an institutional foundation to reverse engineer the labor market. Okay, so I'm going to shift now. How much time do I have?
Honestly, you can keep talking. Most of us will stay. Those that need to leave will need to drop off, but please.
All right, I'll try not to just spend too much, but let me just give you a little sense of what's happening in the United States. So, okay, these are the pieces that you can look up at the Levy Institute that kind of motivated some of these questions. But one of the things that was really striking is when you look at the correlation between those who voted for Trump and prime working age unemployment, it was really very, very strong. The counties that had higher prime working age unemployment proportionally voted more for Trump than those with the lowest. And so he won in economically distressed counties, overwhelmingly among Americans who depended heavily on government assistance. And I'm just literally writing this chapter now. I mean, I document this in great detail. Look at the GDP per county. You could look at it by income levels. You could look at it by education levels. The New York Times had a nice summary for the last 3 elections. And what you find is that in terms of the shifts, where voters went for Democrats, they didn't get any shift observed at those who made more than $60,000 annually. And so just for context, in the United States, I believe the median is 60,000, right? So, we're talking about, more affluent and when you look at counties, it's all affluent counties that went for Democrats. Right? They're concentrated around the 100,000 mark, etc. Where the shift that you see that went for Trump is all below those income levels. And you can see the same thing by education. But what we argue with Randy is this is not a Trump phenomena. I mean, some of you in the US may have seen his State of the Union address last year. And he says, oh, the country turned red. It gave me an overwhelming mandate. And so what we're documenting now is that the country had been red for a very, very long time. This is not a Trump phenomena. The Democrats had lost rural areas for a very long time, and some of the long-term trends, everybody was shocked why the Latino vote for him. But no, Democrats have been seeing a decline in the Latino vote since the 60s. Rural communities, they were 50-50 in the early 90s. Now they're 30-70 for Republicans. And so Democrats have kind of given up on the rural community and have decided as an electoral strategy to focus on suburban areas. Granted, they represent a larger share of the vote, but rural communities are not insignificant in terms of population. And when you're losing, 20% as a share of your vote, that still translates into millions of people. But more importantly, it is saying, who are you talking to? It is saying, what kind of messages you're, if you're thinking that you're going to attract more suburban, wealthier, educated voters, that was a failed strategy because for the first time in 20 years, they lost the suburban vote. And when you look at the composition of the suburban households, they're like America. They're working class households. They're not that wealthy in terms of, the proportion of the voting population. So we see a steady decline in and also this is important, a steady decline in people who self-identify as working a lower class. So in the US, there's a very big cohort of independent voters, and then the rest are, Democrat and Republican. But when you look at those who self-identify as working class, Democrats is basically collapsing and the Republicans is increasing, which is a big shift because the Republicans were typically associated with the kind of more affluent, pro-business, etc. So then I looked at some of these bellwether states, how they did after the great financial crisis. One of the arguments that we make is that the great financial crisis was so devastating that that's actually more or less when the country turned red. But, when you look at it, the country had kind of been turning red since the 80s, really the rise of the neoliberal era. But why this may have been useful to Democrats is because Obama in his re-election lost significant chunks of the vote in competitive states. And this should have been a sign. And then, of course, Trump's first election. And even when Biden wins, they lose a share of the vote in these critical states. The country continues to become red. Blue turns pink, pink turns red, red turns deep red. Okay, and so then, another way to look at this is, just to show some of these maps, and I'm just looking at how Democrats won, right? In terms of at county level, the vote that they attracted. And the country really was blue more as an anomaly. Really FDR arguably and Johnson were kind of the presidents where you had deeper blue and more widespread blue. And, the argument here is that it did have something to do with this broad coalition that they put together through the New Deal reforms or the Great Society that Johnson advocated there. And I'm talking about the economic factors, right? I want to acknowledge there are obviously other factors in electoral shifts, but here we have, and I'll make the argument, we have a very clear economic message that resonates. And presidents like Clinton, who were thought as the working class presidents, etc., they really didn't quite galvanize the interest of the working classes as much. And again, Obama, in recent history was the first that had more of a Rooseveltian message. But again, by then the base had shifted, and the electoral game was played at urban and suburban areas. And of course, this was such a significant crisis, and with such a timid response that nothing structural changed. In fact, things got worse for working people. And so what we are arguing is that the working class, there's a 38% of working class voters that shift in between, parties, or between voting and not voting. And we argue that this is mostly a protest vote. The voter is basically saying, throw out the bums vote, right? Crises always favor, not the incumbent, but, the challenger. And then, some visions resonate with the voters, but then those messages, those promises also bounce. And so we really don't have coalitions that can last. Biden attempted to build a broader coalition, but it couldn't last because it didn't have like a kind of the economic underpinning that we believe could have sustained it. And what we do in our work is we document how his message changed. So here, just for the MMT crowd, one of the critical pieces is that Biden began with an overarching vision of building back better, of rebuilding America, of climate investments. And he had a care agenda in his initial kind of in his campaign and in the early days of his presidency. But he did not manage to pass the agenda. The care component fell. And then the communication, the pivoting really became totally confused. And most importantly, the pivot went to deficit reduction. I mean, that was kind of the dominant theme that you heard, Biden in the second term. We reduce the deficit. Nobody cares. Okay? People cared about affordability. Okay, so as I said, the working class voter is the swing voter. As I said, 26 of eligible voters 26% change voting behavior, but non-voters as a share of eligible voters are 34 to 38%. Like, this is a huge chunk. So there are people on the sidelines that are not voting. And those people, just like voters, tend to be more progressive than typically understood. So they do tend to be younger, lower income, greater financial burden. But what's interesting is that 21% of them are established progressives. I mean, they will lean Democratic, but they're even left of traditional Democrats, and they're civically engaged. They have very strong views on on issues. As I said, they tend to be progressive issues. And then you have another 20% that are modern moderates who tend to lean Democratic, and they also have strong views on issues. Only 17% of the electorate is traditional conservative. And I think something like only 8% of people don't really know what the issues are. They're so disengaged. They tend to be very poor. They tend to be unemployed women. So, we argue that this idea of the undecided voter is totally a myth. We have a disengaged voter. We don't have, we have a dispirited voter. We don't have a, undecided voter. 64% say that they want major decisions and that impact their life, and they don't see a candidate, the primary reason for not voting. They don't see a candidate who speaks to their issues. All right. So, as we said, the Democratic Party has become the party of the comfortable classes. And why is this a problem? Is because the economy is highly unequal. When you have, a U.S., everybody's talking about the K-shaped economy, right? The well-to-do are doing well, the, working class are not doing so well. But the reality is that it is such a highly unequal economy that they're speaking to a very small cohort of voters. Okay, so I updated my inequality chart, which some of you are familiar with. I'm kind of waiting for the Piketty and Saez to release the next data point. But this is a good one still, because in 2020 and 2022, you might recall economists were saying how, finally, wages are rising on the bottom. It's the strongest recovery we had seen. And really, if you look at this data, inequality actually worsened. Big businesses and those who derive income from the financial sector and from corporate profits did quite handsomely. All right, just briefly on the state of working America. I mean, this to me has been always the most frustrating thing. So many economists and so many pundits were saying, don't people get it? This is the best economy in the post-war period. And it was once again talking down to the working class person who was, and when I say working class, I'm really talking about the vast majority of American families who are struggling with childcare, healthcare, housing issues. I mean, that is really, so I have some data on the housing squeeze. I'm going to skip these, but these are the core issues. And when folks were focusing on the squeezing, the disappearing discretionary dollar on inflation, it wasn't just that prices were, we've never seen the increase in prices in eggs in a long time. It wasn't just that. It was that people understood that their paycheck didn't go far enough. There's always two sides to the story, right? The squeeze on eggs will not be, the problem with egg price increases is not going to be as dramatic if you are able to see significant increases to your income, wage, security, affordability in other areas of your life. Okay, so there are many ways to tell the story of working America. Low unemployment is not a good indicator of American well-being. It's whether jobs are secure, well paid to support a family. But Americans are increasingly worried about their jobs. The labor market is kind of in a holding pattern in the US, low hire rate. But the surveys are also showing serious concern. So what do voters really want? Very brief kind of survey of some of the polling. As I said, the ballot initiatives, without exception, with one exception, a very peculiar case, minimum wage ordinances have passed since '98. When there's no federal action at the federal level, people put a ballot at the state level, and they increase their wage. They're counting on these local, policy moves to improve their well-being. And at the federal level, we don't even have anyone who's willing to co-sponsor Bernie's minimum wage increase bill. Okay, paid leave, tipped worker pay, art, culture, that people tend to support all of these. And super interesting also in the US, I did not realize this until I started researching this. There have been 100 bills to restrict or overturn these ballot initiatives. And in Missouri, the state that just voted for Trump and just passed a paid sick leave, their government, their legislation, passed a law to overturn it. Because this was not a constitutional amendment, they scrapped the will of the people. So people went, protested, etc. Now they have to put it again on the ballot to be able to pass it as a constitutional amendment, so they can't touch it. But it is such a extraordinary thing that the elected representatives essentially are aggressively overturning the will of their voters. In terms of polling, minimum wage increases are very popular. Ending taxes on tipped incomes. 85% support medical leave. I mean, we are the only major country that doesn't have paid leave. Something that's interesting is that now more Republicans are starting to believe that corporations have too much market power. That's a significant shift in their attitudes. So I think, anything that policies that attempt to constrain corporate power, I imagine, are going to be popular. Majority believe the climate change is causing harm to Americans. And education is too expensive. And only 33% of Americans are satisfied with their pay. And so something that seems to come out from some of these surveys is that, Americans tend to apply a litmus test on various policies. How is it going to affect my job? How is it going to affect my paycheck? And so I've shown this before to some audiences. It might be in my book, I don't remember. Maybe it's not. Yeah, I don't remember. But when you ask what kind of policies Americans favor, federal health insurance, like government should see to it that everyone who wants work can find a job is top of the list. And the second one is health insurance. So, jobs and healthcare, I think, are two very important issues for Americans. And then income inequality, of course, and receiving welfare benefits actually doesn't garner a lot of support. Americans are not super supportive of welfare benefits. And there are some lessons here, I think, in terms of the very large income support that was provided during COVID, that was essential in patching up, right? Like, people, over the crisis, but it did not yield electoral dividends. That did not seem to be. Yeah. All right. So job guarantee. I've shown you. I've shown this to others. It's really overwhelmingly popular across different demographic groups. COVID increased its support, but that conversation is now being reinserted. I think in the we're working with the U.S. coalition to reinsert that. Policy on the agenda. And what's interesting is when you survey youths, this is a new survey that I found, they want to serve. They want expanded opportunities through AmeriCorps, and they want to, they consider it part of their civic duty. So to me, a youth job guarantee is like a no-brainer. Okay, I'm not going to go through these visions. But maybe worth just like pausing to see how different presidents communicated. We could maybe discuss this in the Q&A. What was interesting is that the message from Kamala Harris was an opportunity economy. And she did have a care component to her policy package, but I think that it didn't resonate with the electorate very much because Biden wasn't able to pass the care package. In fact, it dropped out of the agenda. It was, at first with the Build Back Better, that was it was very well conceived because it wasn't just infrastructure; it was also care. But when that disappeared, I think that the care message maybe fell on deaf ears, or the electorate probably it didn't resonate. And when you talk about an opportunity economy where everybody has a chance to compete in an economy that's rigged and that is people are trying to hold on to their jobs and their incomes, it also is not the most inspirational message. At the same time, you have somebody who's willing to tear it all down, right? And talks about how we're failing nation and we're not being treated fairly. I think many families probably felt personally that way. That they were that the labor market is not treating them fairly. They're working hard, and they can't get ahead. And so there are some lessons here in terms of what the policy agenda needs to be. I'm not going to talk about abundance. Okay, we have unfinished business. We haven't secured the right to a job. We haven't secured medical care for everyone, and we need to address that. So here are some components of a progressive policy framework. But I want to say that this is not a portmanteau of policies. This is not just your laundry list. It needs to be articulated in a similarly similar new vision of what government's role is, how it would work for the American public, and kind of re-envisioning both government, both the economy, and what the basic floor for economic security must be, right? So I'm not proposing that vision here, but it cannot be just throwing just little pieces of this agenda. It needs to be kind of a comprehensive network, a comprehensive framework, much like the New Deal was once. Okay. Oh yes, that's what I just said. All right. I know you have a graduate program at Torrance University, but I thought I would plug in the Levy Economics Institute graduate programs as well, because we are still accepting applications I'm happy to talk about what we do at Levy. But thank you very, very much. And I'm happy, if we have time, I'm happy to answer questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Pavlina. That was really super interesting for a kind of politics nerd like me. And I think most of the people on this call, on this meeting, are in furious agreement. There's been some chat in the meeting chat about different types of voting. Would that help? Would that make a difference to have the kind of voting that we have in Australia? All sorts of solutions that wouldn't on their own work, but perhaps might form some way forward. Stephen, did you spot any questions that you think we should start with?
There are almost too many.
Yeah.
Coming too quickly for me to keep up with.
I have one here from Tom, which might be a good one. Tom's just posted, what about the fact that people seem to live in different realities with different basic facts? And I remember that Naomi Klein's written about this and she termed it the mirror world. Do you have a comment on that?
For me, the issue is whether this is a cause or effect. Clearly, these things feed on each other, but it is hard for me to imagine that we never had in years past polarization. And I think whatever I read about Nixon's presidency, I didn't live in the US at the time, it really sounds very much like what we're going through right now, on so many levels. The New Deal was not a moment where people were unified. The South kicked and screamed. They did not like some of these minimum wage reforms and labor reforms. And yet, the policies were able to build enough support. So to me, I think the question is, how do we reach people who are seeing different realities, but we speak to their shared experience and to their shared problems? Because there will be certain things that we can't bridge, but on the issue of whether you're able to find a home and afford that home, I imagine there's far more consensus. And when you see your neighborhood that is being bought up by Berkshire Hathaway, and all the second house has a sign that's hanging, and you are trying to and the way it works here, people go with cash offers and they still strike out. Investors come in and outbid them. People get this. They understand. When you're on the phone and you're negotiating with your health insurance and you can't cover, it doesn't matter whether you're reading the worst right-wing whatever blog or the left-wing podcast. It doesn't matter. Everybody's trying to take care of an elderly parent, right? And I feel these are the sorts of things. And we document which were the Democrats that outperformed the national ticket, Kamala Harris, and the kind of messages that they communicated. And it had to do exactly with this, with corporate power, with unaffordability, with paychecks.
Where do you think the tipping points might be? I'm asking a bit of a prediction question here, perhaps.
Oh, I see. It's very hard to say. If you're asking about what is happening now in the US and whether there will be a shift, I don't see any reason why there won't be another protest vote. There's still, there's a fair amount of support that Trump garners for his policies, but on the immigration issue, he is starting to lose some of his base. That could be a tipping point. And it's not necessarily because, people, we need to see what conversation develops. They were, as I said, in the postmortem, there were a few, Chris Murphy from Connecticut was one of the first ones, maybe one of the very few ones who recognize the party's responsibility for embracing neoliberal policies. Right? So, Bernie came out as like, you forgot the traditional base. Others came out, Ro Khanna, right? You're not talking to the working classes. Ro Khanna went and did town halls in Republican strongholds to talk to people and see what's going on. I mean, what are the issues that you care about? Very few were able to acknowledge that the embrace of neoliberal policies had to do with this. In fact, at the consultant level, at the kind of, the Democratic Party level, the consultants were saying, no, you have to marginalize the left voices. You need to talk about guns and patriotism. Yeah. There were a few other recommendations that were just completely absurd, but, and try to attract some of the moderate Republican voices. And this is such a failed strategy. There was the famous saying of Chuck Schumer, who said, for every working class person that we lose, we're going to get 2 moderate Republicans. It never happened. They just kept bleeding, working class support.
Thank you. I have one of our graduates actually here. Joseph sent in a question about the job guarantee, and I'd like to hand over to him to ask it. He's actually involved in the union movement and working towards something practical. So take it away, Joseph.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Hi.
Yeah, so we're working on a proposal to put to the unions to get union support, and a question's come up about developing trials or testing it out as such. And obviously the benefits of a job guarantee are going to be sort of more seen on more broad-based, larger sort of things, and just whether you had an opinion on whether smaller pilot trials would be effective, or if you had any suggestions about, implementing a smaller pilot trial or something like that.
People want to do something good. Never gonna consider that, a waste of time. The question is whether it is the effective strategy to move us to the next step. So in some places, the pilot project has worked with some success. The pilot method, I'm talking about the French 0 long-term unemployment areas. And, giving people jobs changes their lives, changes the community, and they did it on a large enough scale, they were able to expand quickly. And then they lost their funding. And now the program is on the chopping block.
Yeah.
And we don't know its future. On the other hand, another very depressing development, in India, we have a national program, which is, passed into law as a constitutional right, which is currently being reformed by the right-wing government. And basically, but it is a legal framework. So, now there are parliamentarians who are trying to launch, legal action against this new program. I mean, if you have a, authoritarian who wants to, smash and grab and just, destroy, the public sector, that will happen. That does happen. But, which is the more effective method of doing big social safety net programs? My impulse will be to kind of push for the big policy than the small one. And we often say, we didn't pilot Social Security to know that we needed it. But I think, what people want to see is how it can be done, right? I think that, perhaps you can share, that's what unions are interested in, what jobs you're going to have, right? Could you mobilize your resources quickly? Is that the concern that you're hearing?
Yeah, so there's 2 things with the union. The first one is, what's it going to be paid? Is it going to be linked to collective bargaining? Those are really big constraints for the union to get support. Then once you get into how do we trial it on a smaller scale, the issues are about how is can the government be effective in sort of administering this thing? And then do we want to I mean, what benefits do the community want to see in like this in a smaller scale? Because there's areas where there's really high unemployment that would benefit from it, like at a local level. But can those local benefits be sort of seen at the macro level? Can, local and state governments see those benefits to like in the economy rather than just at the local level type of thing? And I guess we're at the planning stage about how would we sort of get it sort of, beyond this. And yeah, like, I mean, it's just really something that we're sort of trying to figure out. Would a
Yeah.
smaller pilot be beneficial,
I think that a smaller pilot will not demonstrate the macro effects that we are talking about, in terms of the stabilizing effect, the opt out. Like a local program, unfortunately, won't be able to provide on demand employment,
Yep.
which is kind of the beauty of the job guarantee. So when the New Deal programs were being implemented, there was the same dialogue between unions and government, and the way that dialogue was resolved is to have unions on the board of the WPA and the other works projects, so that they don't compete with union work. You can do something like that now. I think, and I've written, the job guarantee needs to be unionized. That definitely, can assuage some of the fears. I think that the service unions in the U.S. Understand precarity, so we tend to have more pushback from the trades unions because the wages are a lot higher, etc. The service unions don't have nearly the same protections, and etc. So they have signed on to our job guarantee pledge, and what I believe is necessary is that we see the macro framework within which union work takes place. Because, a union is responsible for their members. They're responsible for fighting for their workers. And they operate in the context of unemployment because, but it's not their job to create full employment. The job of creating full employment is the government's job. And if they can re-envision what their work might look like if the threat of unemployment was hanging, I think that then we can get more political support. I think that the pilot projects can reveal a certain set of things. And so there's a small pilot project in Austria. You might be familiar with it. It tends to show the health benefits, the mental health, the physical health, some of these non-pecuniary benefits. There are these projects, the pilot projects in Europe have also shown some of the savings that occur from the government, but they have very generous social welfare systems. And so people opt out of their unemployment insurance to go to the job guarantee. And for all intents and purposes, the financial expenditures are more or less the same. But now you've got this, the well-being, the dignity in work, the positive social multipliers. I think this is not insignificant, and I think it's vastly ignored at the macro level. So I think small-scale projects are beneficial to demonstrate those individual level effects, but the macro effects, I'm afraid, through small pilots, you won't be able to study.
Okay, no worries. Thank you very much.
Isn't it amazing, though, that we've got to a point in Australia where trade unions think the government can't organise anything? I mean, it's just extraordinary how far we've gone in that direction. So the unions are heading towards neoliberalism, effectively, or at least taking a step there. And I wonder whether we are at a tipping point in that, the switch has thoroughly happened in the US. The US is a thoroughly captured state, a dysfunctional society because it's a thoroughly captured state by the elite. And now that elite is looking to Americanize the world. I mean, that's what's happening at the moment. The Elon Musks and the rest of them, having taken over the US, are taking over everybody else. And I wonder whether what's happening at the moment is a movement in the other direction. Even the speech of Mark Carney, whether actually we're going to see the rest of the world take a stand, or people around the rest of the world say, well, look at the US.
Mm.
We need to move in the opposite direction. I see that as a source of hope, almost a hope that what's happening outside the US might feed back into the US, and we might have gone as far as we're going to go. I certainly hope that that's the case. Otherwise, what's happening in Minnesota is going to be happening in South Australia at some point. We don't want to be going in that direction any further. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think that neoliberalism was born here and Americanized the world. I mean, I see that, what you're pointing to as a Trump phenomena. In some ways, I see it as coming to our shores a little bit later than in other places. Like we've been spotting this stuff, and with the political shifts in Germany, I mean, in Europe, and Europe, as we MMTers well understand, has structurally dysfunctional ways of dealing with their crisis, like barriers to dealing with their crisis. They just can't, they can't re-engineer the darn project to be able to tackle economic crisis. So they're caught into this kind of, shift to the right, and that will continue. We've seen it in other places, and so I feel that has caught up. That's come to our shores.
But they still have a welfare state. They have free healthcare when you need it. They have free higher education in a lot of these places. The things that you listed as policy goals for the US, 80% of them exist in Europe.
Yes, you are correct that there is a certain dimension to quality of life there that a lot of Americans don't. I mean, one way to look at this is, could this be a kind of a reordering of not just power, but of economic models? Like that, to me, is the interesting question. Is this really the death of market fundamentalism? And I think neoliberalism is not exactly, it is market fundamentalism, but state-run. So it's not like free, libertarian market economy. It is very much a state-run, market fundamentalism. So to me, this is a bit of a consolidation of big corporate power. I mean, the kind of mergers that are happening here, the kind of control over whether it's airwaves, whether it is print, whether it is tech companies, that doesn't bode well for democracy at all. Even if, you've got, Trump loses the election and loses the next one and the next one, right? Like is America, spreading its own kind of poison to the rest of the world? Yeah, it's certainly giving permission to others, to do the same. I do have to acknowledge that there are countries that have experienced this, and and they have had, brutality, etc. It's and it is very it's, I don't know, for somebody who has lived in a state that did not, did crackdowns in various shapes and forms. It's very disturbing to me what I'm seeing, not only because we care for our neighbors, but because of what it does to the culture and to society and to the kind of alienation that it creates. And that these, this is so hard to patch, the cultural fallout that comes from the, this economic polarization and the police state and all of that. So yeah, I'm rambling a little bit, but
it's okay. But I have a great question here.
I will say this. I'm only going to say this, that America is a messy place, and there, I'm not so sure it rolls over so easily. So I'm there's pushback. I'm not sure that these shenanigans are going to stick.
Can I come to a question from Susan? She wrote, Pavlina, do you think that your excellent policy framework can be successfully offered and received absent a heterodox/MMT explanation of public money, of how the monetary system really works?
I mean,
Because we're working on that.
this ultimately will remain as the cog in the wheel, of any fundamental policy shift. I mean, look, we tend to give up deficit myths when regularly, right? Politicians give up deficit myths when convenient. So I can imagine, somebody quite willing to give up these, fiscal responsibility,
Easy come, easy go. Yeah.
Exactly. So, but is it gonna, is the deficit myth going to be weaponized against the government? Yes, absolutely. So I think that you're right that a progressive agenda will not stick or last unless we're also willing to understand and embrace the proper functions of a, monetarily sovereign government. We've seen this in history. We know what happened to FDR and what happened to the jobs programs. They were not authorized because of conservative budget directors, right? And I was thinking a little bit about this recently. And there's a critique of the left. So much of, left mobilization comes around taxing the rich, right? And taxing the rich, we've always said you got to tax the rich, it's important. But it's such a weak tool of political action. It is such a weak tool of transformation. And not because you are tethered to the tax for your own progressive policies, which you don't need. You're not in a monetarily sovereign nation. It's not only because you tether your fate to the existence of the wealthy, but also because a framework that taxes income and wealth is a framework that validates certain incomes and certain wealth, right? Like we need to be thinking about, like what Keynes argued, euthanizing certain streams of income, right? Like carried interest, like why is this a permissible form of income, right? And just sort of working at the reform level rather than at the do what you please, we'll tax the heck out of you after you've done it. Of course, the class struggle is going to be battle is going to be far more contentious once you've allowed these things to happen, and then you just want to take them away, right? So it is another kind of way of answering your question, that we need to be thinking in completely new ways about public finance. And this is it. This is what you guys are doing. This is what we've been trying to do for a long time.
Thank you. We've got somebody with a hand up here. Ralph. Ralph, are you with us? Okay, maybe we'll come back to that person.
Well, we better restrict not too many more minutes because we're taking.
Yeah, absolutely. We're taking your time. Ralph, go ahead.
I had difficulty getting. Yeah, I'm muted. Actually, it's a somewhat unrelated question, and that is this: the Levy Institute planning a conference in the coming year?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. This year is actually the Institute's 40-year anniversary. So we're about to send out the announcement on May 7th and May 8th is going to be our anniversary conference. And so please, you're invited. Keep it on your radar. We will be putting out a save the date announcement very soon. We have some, confirmations that are, some good speakers.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I think all of our students will be very interested in that. Can I just ask, can people listen in online? If that's
Unfortunately,
possible?
it is an in-person experience.
Okay, fair enough.
Yes. So, and this year we're not able to do a summer school, but it's quite possible the year after we might move back to an online version of the conference. we'll see.
Okay.
Stand by.
No, that's great. I'm sure some of us
And
at least
actually, you
will
know what?
make the
Hang on
journey.
a second. Wait, hang on a second. We do record them. We do
Okay,
record them
yeah.
and put them afterwards on our YouTube channel. So yes,
Fantastic.
Well, that's
just
great.
not real. Yeah, real time.
I hope at some point, I hope you get the funding to do summer schools again. Just to say, what a terrific experience as I was I wasn't the oldest, I was the second oldest there in 2012, but that's where I met Dirk
Yes,
Ends. We
that's
both
right.
came to that 2012 summer school, which was a wonderful experience. And let me also say, if you are looking for a face-to-face graduate program, then Bard Colleges and Annandale-on-Hudson, beautiful place to go and to work with outstanding academics or to any connection to outstanding academics like Pavlina and the other people there. We very strongly recommend it. We're not in any sense in competition, and indeed this online program that we set up here in PAR is just a result of the fact that there were no online programs until we started this one. But we strongly recommend Bard College and the Levy Institute. And a couple of our students went to a conference there
Yes. Yeah.
last year. It was great.
Fantastic. Yes, it was a great. Yeah, I thought it was one of our better, conferences and summer schools. So yes, we've been doing this a long time, and it's always such an amazing experience, and connections that last forever. Friendships and connections. We've kind of sent into the world so many people that have come through the summer school. It's amazing to see like the kind of work that they're doing. But yes, thank you very much for the kind words, Stephen.
That's a great note to end on, I think. There's lots to be hopeful about. Come join a program wherever you are. If you want to study with us, it's not too late to join. If you want to study at Levy, please get in touch. We can point you in the right direction. Join a group, be part of something, be with like-minded people.
Look out for Pavlina and Randy's book when it comes out. And if you haven't read Pavlina's Case for a Job Guarantee, you should have done.
Yes, fantastic book. Very easy to find. We might put that in the link with the video recording too. One last question. Do you mind if we share your video recording, and do you mind if we share your slides too? Would that be okay?
No, not a problem. We'll happy to share them, send them over.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, I'll stop the recording, and let's virtual clap. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming, everyone. Thank you for joining in the seminar. Thanks
More or less blackmail Pavlina into letting us have the slides there by putting that question on the recording. But
I can edit that out. I did.
We'll see you about the slides. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the invite. Good to see you guys.